أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما والحمد لله على كل حال سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم إني أعوذ بك أن أدل أو أدل أو أزل أو أزل أو أذلم أو أظلم أو أجهل أو يجهل علي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, alhamdulillah, we have myself, Ustad Abdul Muhaymin, and an esteemed guest live from London, the internationally known Mustafa Briggs. Our brother Mustafa Briggs is a graduate of Arabic and International Relations from the University of Westminster, and whose dissertation focused on the Arabic literature and literacy in West Africa. He's currently also studying at Azhar University in Cairo, where he's pursuing another degree in Islamic Studies in Arabic. He rose to international acclaim for his program, Beyond Bilal, A Black History in Islam. It was a lecture series which saw him explore and uncover the deep-rooted relationship between Islam and Black history and the legacy of contemporary African Islamic scholarship and its role in the international relations of the Muslim world. He's been on Al Jazeera, the Islam Channel, discussing themes such as Islamic history, blackness within Islam, and he's doing all kinds of other great work. Well, alhamdulillah, we wanted to invite him here to talk about, our greater theme, which is about oppression and the oppressors, and then some subtopics that we thought were relevant. One of them today being exploring the relationship between, the so-called immigrant community and the African-American community. Basically, what we want to do with this is we want to talk about some of the issues. I mean, in an hour and 15 minutes, it's impossible to go deep into all of the issues, but we want to mention some of the issues. And inshallah, we would like to mention some solutions also. This is just this is one of those issues that has arisen on an international scale due to the incident involving George Floyd. So I would just like to take about maybe 5 or 6 minutes, inshallah, and give a framework for what, inshallah, we're going to be talking about. Starting off, I would like to say that in all of the Western countries, where they're Western democratic countries, the African American Muslim community is the largest indigenous Muslim community. We have hundreds of thousands of African American Muslims who either converted to Islam or they were born to families whose families converted to Islam. And this was the situation on the ground throughout the 20th century up until about the 1980s. In the 1980s, there were, starting in 1965, there was a National Origins Act, which allowed other than Europeans to migrate to America, to, pursue a better life, and they were guaranteed the freedom to practice their religion, et cetera, et cetera. What we have seen is that the immigrant community, when they first started coming in 1965, all the way through the 1980s, there has been a separation between the Muslims who had established Islam here in America, especially amongst the African Americans, and to a lesser extent, some Latinos, and the immigrant community that migrated here. There's a plethora of reasons. There's a lot of reasons. And to try to simplify it and say that it's only because of race, not only would it be a lie, but it would be an insult to intelligence. But some of the issues that I would like to talk about today is number one, that there are issues with class. Okay, the vast majority of African Americans that converted to Islam in America, you know, in the early 1900s, all the way up through the 1960s, they were from the underclass or the working class. Now, if you look at the Muslims who came from, you know, from the Middle East or from, you know, Indo-Pac countries, they were wealthier. They had, you know, they had a background of Islam for hundreds, sometimes, you know, more than 1,000 years in the countries that they came from. They were very ambitious. They were educated and they were professional. So this is one clear reason, one clear, you know, thing that drove the two groups of Muslims apart in America. Another thing was resources as far as Islamic education was concerned. As far as Islamic education was concerned, there was not a professional scholarly class amongst the African Americans here in America. And so they kind of capitulated. They capitulated to, you know, the immigrant Muslims who came, and they allowed them to basically assume leadership because of their background. You had, you know, if Hufaz, if people who memorized the Quran by heart did not come with them, they could easily bring them. If they did not have, you know, fuqaha or ulama that did not come with them, they could easily summon them to come to America. Whereas African Americans had not, you know, as a whole class, a professional class, did not have a chance, you know, to go and study overseas. Well, alhamdulillah, it's happening now. But at that time, it did not happen. There were also different agendas of progress from the Middle East and from a lot of the Indo-Pac countries. You know, there were theological, there was differences in theology, there were differences in approaches to how to deal with Islamic law. There were also different agendas as far as reviving Islam. So this allowed many different groups, you know, many different groups to come from all over the Muslim world, and they superimposed their agenda on the African American agenda. The African American agenda was more about fighting white supremacy, using Islam as a form of resistance against white supremacy. And, you know, if you contrast this with what was coming from overseas, it was more, you know, political issues. What was happening in Palestine? What was happening with the Tablighi Jamaat? What was happening, you know, with the Ikhwani movement? You know, it was a lot of different issues. These are just a few wedges that we can talk about. And so inshallah, starting there, and you can add to it anything you would like to add. But I would just like to ask our brother Mustafa Briggs, how do you see this? How do you understand it? And what is your experience as a result of some of these wedges? Bismillah.
Okay, Bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum, inshallah. It's an honor to be your guest, and it's an honor to be invited to take part in this conference and in this discussion. According to what you've said, I mean, this was something that I find very, very interesting, and I feel like being Black British of West African origin, but growing up in the UK, but most of my tours, most of my lectures, etc., take place in the USA. So comparing the two communities, I can see similarities, and then I can also see differences. And what is interesting is that you mentioned white supremacy as Islam being a form of resistance against white supremacy, and it had that political background within the African American community, which then led them to Islam. Whereas I feel like with a lot of us in the UK, it's not exactly the same case, but then we're also inspired by the African American struggle. So if you think about the fact that the African American community is a 400-year-old community, essentially they're a 400-year-old community that they've been in the USA and they've become US citizens, and the America that we know was built on their backs and the backs of their struggle. When we look at the regions where these people were taken from in Africa, we can estimate that over 50% of those people taken were probably Muslim when they were taken. But because of the horrors of slavery, we understand families were split apart, people were renamed, people were forced to practice different religions from the religions that they practiced originally. Plantations, people's children were sold to other plantations, husbands and wives were separated, and the family structure was demolished in order to rebuild it in a way that would suit the system that was in place. We can see then that the prayers of those Muslims is what brought Muslims out of the African American community in the 60s. Because, you know, everything has an outward and an inward. Outwardly, we can say it was an act of political resistance, we can say it was, but inwardly, if we look back at the Prophet ﷺ's ancestor, Ibrahim, the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith where he said, I am the Dua of Ibrahim. And when we go to Surah Baqarah, we see that when Ibrahim establishes the house of Allah in Mecca, and then he and his son stand up and ask Allah to accept it from them, he said, وَجَعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. He said, oh Allah, make us Muslims who submit to you, and from our descendants bring about a nation of Islam that will also submit to you. And then he prays, and send amongst them a prophet that will teach them the book and teach them the wisdom and teach them what they did not know and purify them. And we see that prayer being answered over 3,000 years later with the coming of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Between the time of Ismail and Ibrahim and the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they lost their way, they forgot their original religion, and then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent to answer that dua of Ibrahim, the dua of the ancestors, and bring them back to the path of their ancestors. We can see then the parallels when we look at stories of people like, when we look at stories of people who were taken, like Ayuba Suleiman Jallo, and all of the people that I talk about in my other lecture before Malcolm X, The History of Islam in the Americas, we can see then that the 4 or 5 people whose names we do know are a reflection of the hundreds or thousands of people whose names we don't know. Most of them were scholars, most of them came from scholarly communities that were based on studying the Quran, applying the Sunnah, understanding knowledge of the religion. And when they were taken to these strange lands and their children were separated from them, I'm sure they made these same du'as. And it's the effect of those du'as that manifested themselves in waves in the 60s. But we can see that the most active time is from the 20s to the 60s. And the foundations of Islam there and the foundations of Islam in the immigrant communities then are completely different. Because for them, Islam was a way of reclaiming their identity, and it was a way of them reclaiming their history, and it was a way of them fighting the system that had been oppressing them for 400 years. So it was a tool of empowerment. Whereas for many other people, they came and it was a form of identity to maintain their relationship with their homes, with their immigrant communities. And it was something that could be compromised. Whereas we can see with African American communities that were Muslim, they didn't want to compromise their Islamic identity. They didn't want to tick separate boxes. They wanted to manifest it as it was a symbol of their resistance and a symbol of their power and a symbol of what they had survived. And so when you see the two communities join together in the 60s and the 70s, we see that they start to develop different pathways. Because one pathway is more about maintaining economic success and maintaining the status quo, whereas the other pathway is about being separate from that and establishing a separate identity from that. And when we study the influence that Islam had in the development of the civil rights movement, and then also as well in the development of the early rap community and all of these different contributions, we can see how deep the religion played, the deep role that the religion played in the identity of the African American community. And that's something that I always admire and I look to because in the West, we don't really have that, because most of us are immigrants ourselves. We come from immigrant communities that are dissimilar to the situation that the African American community had found itself in. So in order to see those parallels, I mean, the anti-Blackness and the racism and the different challenges that we might face are similar, but the origins of the community itself is very, very different. And so the approach and the means of approach is completely different. But because the story of the African American people is so unique, and the way they came to Islam and what brought them to Islam and how they manifested their Islam, and what's beautiful as well is that it gave African Americans an opportunity to manifest Islam away from the influence of imported cultures. Some people maybe took influence from Arabs or took influence from Asians, but because they weren't assimilated into those communities, they had to develop a personal identity that manifested Islam in their own way. So we can see, for example, with the Nation of Islam, it was a very African-American form of manifesting the religion, even though the Aqidah, you can have arguments with the Aqidah. But just looking at Nation of Islam, for example, as a social movement, the way that they manifested was very unique, and it's something that we don't really see anywhere else in the world with African communities anywhere else in the world, or communities of African descent. So I mean, I would point the question now then back to you, knowing the history and knowing how this communities formed and the different relationships between the two communities. What is now then the way moving forward, the issues that are happening in between the two communities, and the way to move forward past those issues?
Alhamdulillah, I have some ideas, but I will let Ustad Abdul Muhaymin come in and chime in on this conversation. What do you say, Ustad?
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulih Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. نويت تعالى وتعالى وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة وحث على التماسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير وابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for joining us, Brother Mustafa. And I must say that you have a very good assessment of a lot of the things that have gone on within the history of our community here in America with your visits here. Another thing I would like to add to that is just that as we're talking about this problem of racism, particularly with this particular subject we're dealing with this week, racism between African American, or the relationship between the African American community and the immigrant community. Like Ustad Tabari started off saying, some of that can point towards racism within certain contexts. A lot of it has to also deal with, like he shared, the motivations and the mentality of some of the people who came here in terms of immigrating with the change of the Civil Rights Act in the 60s and on into the 80s, when they had a large influx of people starting to come to this country from places that beforehand had not previously been allowed to come in such large numbers. And as he's talked about, one of the problems that arose out of that, as I saw it, is one of the things that I feel is one of the larger blights that have afflicted people of color in whatever nationality you may have come from across the globe. Anybody who was affected by the colonial or imperial project, all of us had a serious blow dealt to us when we started dealing with these ideas of nationalism. We saw it in the 20s and the 30s, 40s, and culminating into the 50s when Jamal Abdel Nasser came and started his nationalist push through the Arab countries. And although we saw that previously before that with World War I, and we all know what happened into the sacred precincts and all of the machinations that came about as a result of that, and the result of them abolishing the Khilafah, and it was just a whole big ball of mess that came out of that. But within all of that, what was really at the core of all of that was the idea of nationalism. And it took people from having that sense of belonging as Muslims, let's talk about Muslims in particular, took Muslims having that sense of belonging to the community of the Ummah of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, into belonging to this community of my family, my tribe, my group, taking us back to that role of Asabiyya. And we still see the effects of that playing out to this day. So just not forgetting where we're coming from, but just talking about the communities in general, like brother talked about at the beginning with some of the different dynamics that work within that. So you see within some of the Southeast Asian communities, you hear about it all the time. If you talk to some of the brothers and sisters, they tell us about it. So it's not like, so we're talking about some big secret. You'll have certain groups of people. I could be from this village and I won't allow my children to marry nobody from outside of this village, et cetera, et cetera. And it just exacerbates itself into this thing that we're dealing with right now. So what does this happen? So how does this affect us as African Americans? One of the things that it did to us is that being that we had already lost our sense of identity, okay, and our sense of self-value and self-worth in terms of just looking at ourselves in the mirror and engaging with the world on a day-to-day basis. We became Muslim, and as a result of becoming Muslim, according to whatever influence that we were encouraged by at that moment, who was around us, we took to this wholesale adoption of whatever cultural standards that they had as being Islam. And this added even more to our confusion, not saying that the cultural standards of the people that we were connected with were wrong, but that was their cultural standard. But then there was also an opposite that happened with that. And in some aspects, it became excessive for us. And what I mean with that is in terms of us working to identify with our heritage of West African scholarship. This is another thing that we have nowadays. And the reality of our heritage is something that should definitely be embraced and applauded wholeheartedly, cross board. But there's a tinge of asabiya that comes across with that with certain people, because now they take this thing as being West African scholarship is the only scholarship that ever came about in Islam, is the only thing that is applicable to the African American or black person or person of African descent, period. You see what I'm saying? And so even within the context of having a conversation with people who are already thinking like this, you see what I'm saying? And then you putting up this opposing image towards them, it's like now you're butting heads, because it's like, I'm fighting what you got going on because now I'm trying to say what you got is false, I'm right, and then we could perpetuate that same cycle that we were supposed to be trying to get out of in the first place by saying La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So again, that's just my opening take on that based on what you were saying. There's some more I would add to that in terms of just how I feel we can go about correcting that and what needs to be done. But inshallah, let's let the conversation continue.
To add to what Ustad Abdul Muhammad was talking about, I think like one of the things that has happened is on one side of the equation, on the African American side of the equation, they basically they gave up their right, or they gave up their ambition to create a scholarly class by depending upon scholars from other places. Now, I will not only blame this on the immigrant community or the fact that the immigrant community came. I would also blame ourselves. I recently read an article by I believe it was in the Atlantic. It was one of the large publications, national publications, and it was the reporter was talking to Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, rahimahullah, before he passed away, and one of the things that he was saying was that 70% of the imams that followed him, and he had about 1,000 imams under him, but he said 70% of them stood against him when he wanted to get them educated, when he wanted to send some of the youth overseas to get educated. These are his words. right? These were Imam Warithuddin Muhammad's words. And you know, I was shocked by that. I was really, really shocked, because this is you know, cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? You will always be dependent. There's one of two things. There's only one or two things that can actually happen. Either you're going to always be dependent upon outside scholarship, or you're going to be wrong in the decisions that you make, right? Because it's not based upon a sound understanding of the Quran and a sound understanding of prophetic guidance. It's not. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing that I would say, as far as the immigrant community, and I'm using it very loosely because we have, you know, brothers and sisters from, you know, the Indo-Pak region, from you know, the Arab world, from Turkey, North Africa, you know, and they're not immigrants. They've been here for 2 generations, 3 generations, but we still associate them with the immigrants who came. So we need to come up with a different term. But the so-called immigrants, you know, I think what happened on their side is they didn't really understand what Blacks as a whole were up against as far as white supremacy, because there's no communication. There's no communication between the two. And I don't think that they really understood the devastation, how devastating white supremacy is, until after 9/11. And then they began reaching out to, you know, a lot of the African-American, you know, the seniors who had participated in the different civil rights movements. They started reaching out to them and saying, teach us how to overcome these civil rights violations. So I think we lost out on both sides. We lost out. You know, another thing that I think that the immigrant community, you know, lost out on, but I believe that it's slowly coming back. I think they lost out on the ability to capitalize on the truth that Islam is an indigenous religion to America, because many people will look at, you know, the immigrant community and say, they can say, go home. Islam is go take Islam back to where it came from, because they don't have a connection with the greater African-American community, who can tell them, no, your descendants are actually, you have spiritual brothers and sisters who are been buried in the soil for 300-400 years. You have a right to participating in the success of this country just like everybody else. So that distance between, the African-American struggle, the African-American connection to, individuals such as Yaro, Mahmoud, Saeed, Umar ibn Saeed. You have, other brothers and sisters, Ibrahim, Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim. You have so many names that's like in the Smithsonian Museum. That's part of, they get airtime every now and then of Black African scholars who came here. They were writing down Maliki texts, Maliki fiqh texts in Arabic. They were memorizing the Quran. They were teaching the Quran. But because that relationship between the indigenous community, the African Americans, and the immigrant community, it's been lost. And so that connection, that understanding has also been lost. Because every Muslim should have the confidence, every American Muslim, whether they are African American or, whether their family comes from, an Arab country or an Indo-Pak country, they should be able to say, no, my ancestors, my spiritual ancestors are buried here too. They came with the slave trade. So having said that, what is the way forward? What is the way forward? And I'm saying that because like we've already used up about half an hour, and I'm sure we're probably going to have some questions. So how do we move forward? How do we bridge the gap? How do we take the wedge out of the African, the wedge that exists between the immigrant community and the African American community, on all of these different topics that we talked about, Mustafa?
So I would say personally, just from my experience in traveling with the US and the work that I do, I would say the gap is already being bridged, because the new generation, maybe when immigration was first happening in the 60s, the first generation to come were completely separate from the people that they found on the continent already or in the country already. But as they started to have children who grew up in America and had the same kind of shared experiences as, not to the same extent, but growing up in America as American citizens, going to American public school, going to college in America, working in America, they're growing up with African Americans, they're being influenced by African American culture, etc. They have now taken over a lot of these communities, and they're giving birth to their own children, and they think in a completely different way from their parents or their grandparents. So for example, I've come to America and I think I've given lectures in about 20 different universities, I would say. Most of the time when I was invited by MSA or to give a talk at a university or to teach people, and if for those of you who don't know what I talk about or what I lecture about, my two most famous lectures that I've done in America were Beyond Bilal, Black History and Islam, and Before Malcolm X, The History of Islam in the Americas, where I cover all of these subjects. Most of the people that invited me, most of the masjids that invited me, most of the MSAs in the colleges were run by people who come from what we would describe as immigrant communities. So it wasn't African Americans inviting me to speak about African American history and African contribution to Islam. For the most part, about 5 or 6 did, like Islam, mashallah, and a few other places. But the majority, I would say, if I did 25 locations, 20 of those were immigrants, Muslim communities who wanted to understand, who wanted to know, who wanted to learn. And I was able to come into the community and teach them in a way that they understood. And so there were not just adults, not just people in their 30s and 40s, but young people who were growing up, going to the masjid, seeing these programs and understanding and learning this history. It will leave an imprint on their mind and it will give them a completely different approach. And so I would say that the bridge is being gapped, and the best way to bridge the gap is through education and through making yourself aware of the other communities. You know, if we look at when Allah talks about the fact that He made us into different tribes and nations, it's a very, very interesting verse, because Allah said, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَرَّفُوا. So He made us different tribes and nations in order for us to know each other. And irfan is a completely different knowledge from ilm. Ilm is knowledge that you can read in books, you can study. But irfan, ma'arifa, ta'arruf, it comes from experience. It's experiential knowledge. It's going out, dhawq, touching, tasting, interacting with other communities. And so Allah encourages us through the differences that we have to become acquainted with one another and learn from one another. Because there are things that the African American community can learn from the immigrant community, and there's things that the immigrant community can learn from the African American community. So I think only by going back to the Quran, by going back to that verse, لِتَعَرَّفُوا, and understanding what ta'rif really is, and mixing the communities, educating yourself about people's history, educating yourself about people's culture, I think that's the only way that you can move forward to produce a change that will actually affect the community in a positive way.
MashaAllah, that's brilliant insight. Abdul Muhammad, what advice would you give, or what other insight would you give on how we can bridge the gap between the so-called immigrant community and the African American community?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that Brother Musa brought up the ayat, because typically this is the one that we always go to, you know, in terms of how we should be interacting with others, and not putting any bad light on what you just said, but just to give some highlight to something that a lot of us overlook oftentimes. Is the two previous ayat that come before that. It's supposed to be read in conjunction with each other. because the two previous ayat before that tell you how you're supposed to exactly deal with each other in terms of the interaction and dealing with one another, in order for you to get to know each other when you come down to that ayat there. See, that ayat there is the culmination of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed before, because part of what this says, if you check the tafsir, one of the things that was explained, like the previous ayat 11 was revealed, it was started off because of the delegation of Bani Tamim. They came into Medina, talked with the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they made some denigrating and condescending remarks about Amr and Suhaib. Okay, anhum. But the thing about it, you know, again, you go back and review the ayats, Surah Al-Hujurat, ayat 11 through 13 is what we're talking about. So the points within that, just to give people something to go back and, you know, look in and talk about. And if you add something into the chat later on, we'll be checking over that and we can interact that way there as well. But I just wanted to bring that up to highlight there's something that's often overlooked, because one of the things that Allah talks about, he talks about not insulting or talking down or giving nicknames to others as a result of how you view them. Okay, that's the first thing, because what's the first thing that we always do, most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, at some point in time of our lives, until we got our thinking straight, and some of us have not gotten our thinking straight, so we still do the same thing, is we see people and then we have these negative images and ideas about them. And we say these things in our minds. Sometimes we even verbalize them, come out of our mouth, even if we don't say it to their face. We say it to the person who we know that's next to us, who we're close to. Look at this so-and-so, or look at that, whatever, and then you give names and things of that nature there. Well, I'll tell you, don't do that, you know. And why? Because you never know. That person that you're talking about might be much better than you in terms of his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because like Allah tells you at the end of verse 13, the standard that he judges people by is their level of taqwa. Then he goes into ayah 12 and he talks about not having dhan, because in some cases dhan is a sin. So suspecting a person of being a particular way because of how you view them, again, you may castigate a person to be a criminal or a person of fahish or fahisha or things of that nature there, and they're not, you know. Bad assumptions that you have about people, even, and then going further into talking about spying into a person, trying to find their faults and things of that nature there, and then going into the things about riba, backbiting, and having these foul things that you say about a person. And then he goes into that ayat about the men and the women being from tribes and nations and things of that nature there. But just to give insight to people for that there, so we don't lose sight of the Quranic injunction and how that's manifests itself. Because oftentimes you always hear people talking about, oh yes, Allah made us men and women, nations and tribes so we can get to know each other. Okay, but there's a standard of relationship that we should have prior to, during, and after meeting each other. So in terms of what it is that I personally feel holds to one of the things that we can do to correct this situation, and we talked about this before, Tabari, in private conversation, I've talked about this with others, and it's something I've become very strongly in support of at this time, and that's actually being people of Isnad, people of Ijaza. And why do I say that? The religion that we have, the reality of it is that this is an oral tradition. We have to be able to convey the message of Islam to people through our da'wah, but we also have to be able to convey the knowledge of Islam to the people through sound transmission. And this can only be done by being able to gain the knowledge and the understanding of what it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam have commanded of us in terms of practice of the religion within our religious acts and our mu'amalat, our social interactions with other people. So one of the things within the African American community that we have, like you talked about, we have neglected is the ability to have sound and proper understanding of the religion. You know, we have this piecemeal way of going about things, and you could say within the context of, I don't want to say Western society as a whole, because there are a lot of places within the Western world that I have not been to be able to witness how Muslims go about their day-to-day. But particularly within the American context, I can safely say that the vast majority of us really do not care about Islamic knowledge. It's just a fact. You know, we look towards the shuyukh and the dua to be our every and all and everything in terms of how we practice the religion. And one of the things that you see this play itself out oftentimes was within people who take to the spiritual path and making these spiritual realities that we experience within ourselves public knowledge. And if you study the books of fiqh and aqeedah and adab, a lot of times within the commentaries that they talk about the karamat of the awliya, or even within just the general Muslim population, these are not things you should be talking about or going out to share experiences and things like that of that nature with people. But we've made our spiritual life sort of like a show for people. I don't want to get into all of the details because there's a lot of issues that go with that, and you know, a lot of people have been affected by spiritual abuse. So we don't want to try to seem like we're dismissive of the harms of people who engage in those practices and harm other people in the name of religion, because that's not something that we support. And if you know anything about the work that Sheikh Rami does and us at Table, we're very much against these types of practices of spiritual abuse and neglect amongst people. But one of the things that causes this in terms of how people are brought into these types of situations and harm to the extent that their harm is the lack of knowledge. Because most often than not, the people that are doing these things, they don't emphasize the necessity of a person actually learning something. So you have these different persuasions within the religion, okay? And then they emphasize certain aspects of the religion, which are important, but at the same time, it's not the overriding thing that drives you or should be driving you in terms of your interaction with Allah and the deen, Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because everything that we do is predicated upon ilm, knowledge, knowing something. So this goes back to my statement about being people of isnad and ijazah. One of the things that we have a common misconception about is that chains of narration only apply to books of hadith, okay? Ijazahs of transmission and teaching and conveying the message of Islam or certain texts that we have within the tradition, they're all backed up by a sanad, just like a hadith is backed up by a sanad, okay? And this is how not only you safeguard your religion, this is how you also validate the person that stands in front of you and teaches you something. But one of the things that we've gotten to be very lackadaisical about is the transmission of the ilm. So even nowadays, you have people talk about ijazahs of don't really have the value that they used to have before for a number of reasons, primarily because most of the ijazahs that are given out nowadays are just for barakah. Even if a person studies and tries to dedicate themselves to something, we have a number of people who've gone overseas and come back, and in terms of how they relate with the community, whether it's because the community doesn't want to come to them and learn, or because they don't want to support the work that they're doing, and then you have to go out and work 9 to 5, 9 to 9, or whatever, these jobs where you're taking yourself away from giving the people the haqq. You understand? It all surrounds one thing: lack of authority within the religion. So when we talk about in terms of how other people view us and our ability to convey Islam, represent Islam, it all comes down to the fact that we need to be able to have something that shows that we're connected to the tradition. And the only thing that does that for us is the tradition of sanad and this ijazah. You see?
Okay, okay. So I think that what you're saying is that, I think what you're saying is that on the indigenous Muslim side, that we have to own the tradition. We have to claim the tradition. That's exactly. I follow you. I totally follow you. I totally agree with you. As a matter of fact, there are a number of scholars who are making, the same demands. I've heard several African-American, scholars, they've actually gone, they studied the tradition, maybe after a decade, they came back and they are telling the larger community, especially African-American community here in America, you cannot come to the table and you are not going to be able to dictate where Islam goes in America if you do not yourself have mastery over the tradition. There has never been a community that has been fully established in a land, and you know, they had something to say, you know, except that there was a scholarly class. I totally agree with you. I guess my next question would be, and it looks like we lost our guest.
I was just about to say, I think
I think we
he was
lost.
on his phone, so I think he might be trying to get hooked up with some power or something.
Trying to come back. Inshallah, we'll see what happens. Okay, so now we're talking about scholarship. But scholarship, you know, to become a scholar, somebody has to support you.
Yeah.
Okay, most people do not go and become scholars on their own. So we're back at resources. Okay, we're back at resources. How would you, you know, give instruction, or, you know, give insight, or kind of paint a picture on how the African American community can work together with the, you know, so-called immigrant community to create an indigenous scholarly class? Okay, because one group has the resources, the other group does not have the resources, and their struggle for resistance, I'm sorry, their struggle for existence is real. I mean, I'm hearing conversations about, you know, we might lose this masjid in the inner city, you know, because we can't afford, you know, the payments, or the roof is falling in, or, you know, so there's this mad dash for resources. Whereas you have the opposite problem all the way in the suburbs. They have beautiful structures. They have, you know, you know, they have an abundance of resources, but the African American community is not able to capitalize on that. So how would that look in your mind? How would you bring the two together? How would you make that work?
Okay. Well, in terms of the hearts and mind argument in delving into people's true intentions and motivations, that's something we're just gonna have to leave that for a psychological expert, because I don't think we'll be able to figure that part out. In terms of practical things that can be done, there are a couple of things I really would like to see happen within this country amongst the Muslims. And the primary thing that I would like to see happen is the reestablishment of the Waqf system, okay, the endowment system. Oftentimes we hear people talk about, yeah, you know, back in the day, you didn't hear about the scholars asking for money or doing this, that, the third, or whatever. They would just go into these institutions, they would teach the people, and students could come and study it and they need money, whatever. Alhamdulillah, yes, this is true. This is very true. But do you know why they were able to do that? Because you had people within the society, Muslims within the community, who were wealthy, and they established what were called waqfs, okay? One of the things that I believe has been a very negative influence over religious communities in general, not just Muslim community, but religious communities, period, is the 501c3 designation, these nonprofits. That has been a big destabilizing factor in the ability of religious, primarily we're talking about Muslim communities, of being able to establish structures and institutions that are actually for the people, okay? A waqf is like a business. If the wealthy person bought a plot of land or established some businesses to support the educational efforts or whatever, there were things that were attached to it. So like you may have had system of housing that was set up and people were buying and renting the houses, land development where they were growing and producing crops and selling them, and the money supported what was going. Some kind of way, after the money was put up, one of the best things that you could probably look at it and get an idea of how that can be done here in this country now, the form that they have, is a trust, if you want to use that term right there, a trust fund or a trust account. And Muslims make regular contributions to this waqf We can have a waqf that works at a national level that can support Muslims within this community who want to learn and be educated, okay? Or you can do something that has a split purpose, because, you know, we do have a lot of things that go on with Muslims around the globe. And it's not unfortunate, it's not sad, because it's necessary that the money goes there to help them. But the sad part about it is that those who are here within this country, they get less attention than the ones who are outside of this country. You see what I'm saying? And this is where we have. And we also know that when it comes down to distributing our sadaqah and our zakat, primarily it should go to where you reside at before it goes anywhere else. So if you stay here in the United States of America, your zakat and your sadaqah should be, if it's a 60-40, 70-30 split, the majority of that money should stay here in this country to support the people in this country who need it. That's the first thing, if we're going to talk about from a fixed standpoint and people being able to make progress. All right, so establishing a waqf, because this will safeguard that. You find somebody who's responsible. You have waqfs that were established over 1,000 years ago that are still going right now. Some of them in certain countries, they were raided by the governments of those countries for whatever reason, whether it's by the imperial powers who came and colonized them, or whether it was by the administrations that came after their so-called independence. Okay, either way, they were there, and these endowments were established, and they were supported, and they were prosperous, and they worked. That's why they were there. That's why Allah and His Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam legislated these things for us, because it actually works. All right. Another thing that we can do to facilitate the encouragement to grow and learn is to actually not just establish the waqfs. If you don't have that in your community, you do have people who've gone off and studied properly and gained proper understanding of the religion according to the principles and the values of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Okay, and that encompasses, as we know, the four schools of thought, the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya, and that's it. If you talk about the Athari understanding, then this is the sound Athari understanding, as was practiced, that did not go into the realm of anthropomorphism. Okay? Big difference, but we're not going to get in that because this is not an Aqidah class. However, you got people here in this country who are very learned, who have learned a lot. You have institutions in this country that have the ability to produce and are producing well-rounded people. Our ability to access these institutions, however, I'm not sure how or why not. There's something that can be done, something we can look into, but they're there. Okay, in terms of methodology, primarily most of the institutions that I'm aware of within this country belong to the Ahnaf, to the Hanafiya, primarily from the scholars of the Ulum Deoband, and I guess you could just say every major city in this country now has at least one or two Darul Ulums within their locale or within that metropolitan area. Every one. I'm not aware of one that doesn't have one. Okay, but there are also three other schools of thought, three other madhahib within the ummah that are here in this country, and they have people here who are learned, who have went off and learned, and they have something to contribute. And we have this fascination with saying that we want to learn as much as we can about the religion, but we also have a lack of himmah and sincerity in terms of actually doing so. So, I mean, again, this comes down to really being kind of relative. This can't be an objective standard that we're talking about right now, because it's like only certain people are going to do it. So it's not like we could just have this very liberal and idealistic image of how this can go about happening. But for the people who do want to study, we have to make efforts and make a sincere push to actually get people into these places where they can be helped. And another thing that has to be said, there are a lot of scholars here, or people who have went off to learn and studied and been authorized to teach. They have to start sharing the knowledge. Yes, we understand people have to earn a living. Ask me about it, we can have a private conversation one day. I can tell you, we all need money. Trust me, we need money, okay? But at the end of the day, If we remember some of the great stories of some of the ulama and the awliya of this religion, you would have some of the greatest scholars. They would go to the masjid and teach, and nobody would show up. And what would they do? They would just sit there and just teach the angels, as they would say, talk to the wall, you know. And whether it's one or two people show up, if you're doing online classes, only one person shows up every week, and some weeks that person misses, but they go back and look at the recording later, then keep doing what you're doing. Get the information out to the people. And yes, suhbah, being there, connecting one-on-one, letting your student pour you some tea, or do something, other type of chore for you around the house or around the madrasa, that's fine, that's beautiful, it's necessary. It's a connection that needs to be there. But within this age that we're living in right now, it's absolutely no excuse why a person on the other side of the country can't sit down and learn with you. We have to make ourselves accessible. Even if it's just 30 minutes a day that we sit down in front of the computer screen and we let people know, okay, from 9 to 9:30 in the morning, from 8 to 8:30 at night, or whatever it is, I'm going to be on this computer screen. And if you show up to learn with me, ahlan wa sahlan, let's get it on. You see what I'm saying? And make a sincere effort to support and help these individuals who are trying to learn, but the community also has to make a sincere effort to support and engage with the people who have the information. And then we also have some, I'm going to close out with this, we also have some people within the community, going back to the thing about the isnad and the ijazah. It's good that we teach something and we tell a person, yes, go teach this to other people. You know what you know. At the same time, like we talked about, having firmness within transmitting what it is that we know of the religion and being able to transmit it with authority and respect amongst people requires you to be able to have a connection to the chain, back to the author, back to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this also opens the door for you to be able to produce information to support the people, because we always talk about having things within the context of what we're living in right now today. That cannot be done if you cannot produce your chain back to the author of that book. Yeah, you can write a book and share it with people and get it out there, and you can look and see all of the confusion that we got right now because people coming out their mouth and saying some of the most outlandish stuff just because, yeah, they studied and somebody told them they can do it, but they had no chain of authority that validated that for them. And if they did, there was a sense of khiyana, there was a sense of treachery in their transmission of that knowledge because they deviated from what it was that the author and their teachers gave them as a safeguard to uphold. So I know I went all over the place with that, but
no, it's okay.
That's how I feel about it.
Well, alhamdulillah. I mean, because this is true. I mean, this is part of the solution. Creating, an indigenous class of scholars who have mastery and they can't be duped. Because, as we know, many groups have come back and, have duped people who were very trusting, people who were very, they loved Allah and His Messenger, and they were willing to do whatever somebody said was the Sunnah. And as a matter of fact, that didn't happen to be the Sunnah. So we the stories go on and on and on.
And it happens more in our community than anywhere else.
Yes, and for the very reason that we're talking about, right? Because we don't have enough scholars. We need scholars. We need scholars. Okay. So by now the viewers know that that's one of the solutions. Another thing I want to, just kind of talk about and, pick your brain on is okay. So the theme of this program was about the oppressor and the oppressed. And, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam very clearly, he said, help your brother, whether he is the zalim or the madhlum, whether he's the doing the oppressing or he's the one who's being oppressed. Okay. We have a whole community. We have a whole community of people who have experienced racism, bias, discrimination, oppression in every form that has that has been, that comes with being in America. African Americans have experienced every single form of oppression, all right? And continue to, and that's the reason why a lot of people are marching and in all around the country right now. I personally would remind people who are not African American, I would personally remind them of this instruction by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially our brothers and sisters from different places, and they have the resources to help. Okay, so here it is. We have a clear example of a whole group of people who it's well known that they are madhloom. They are oppressed, whether it is that they can't get, access to financial institutions, they can't get access to vote correctly in this country because of voter suppression, whether they cannot properly enter into academic institutions. It goes on and on and on. They don't have the resources to hire lawyers, so they get more time in prison. It goes on and on and on. But madhloom, the fact that a group of people who are Muslim and they exist in spaces where there is oppression is a fact. I would remind my brothers and sisters who don't have to face that on a daily basis to remember that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam very clearly said, help your brother when he is oppressed. Because I have, there's this favoring of those who are doing well, right? There's this side discourse that, well, why can't they help themselves? Why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Why are those people like that, right? So that becomes part of the discourse, even in Muslim circles. What advice or what reminder would you give to your brothers and sisters out of love so that they don't err on the wrong side? Okay? They don't err on the side of the arrogant. They don't err on the side of siding with the zalim, the oppressor. So they don't side, they don't err, on the side of, not being grateful for their blessings that African Americans set them up for, by helping pass civil rights and things like that. This was done by African Americans. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also, he said, men lam yashkur nas, lam yashkur Allah. If you didn't have, if you didn't thank the people who helped you, right, then you didn't have thanks for Allah, right? So how would you, and before we go into some of the questions, because I see there's a few questions, but what would you say? How would you deliver that message? How would you remind our brothers and sisters who are more well off to pay it forward? Pay it forward. Give help out. People who don't have it as well as you, and they don't have it as well as you because they are oppressed. What would you say?
In terms of what could be said, I think the first thing that we really would have to do is that in dealing with one another and trying to get to the bottom of that particular situation is we actually have to have a very honest discussion about a couple of things. Number one is, what is their true perception of me or people who are like me? You see what I'm saying? Because that's the first thing. Oftentimes, and this is just my perception, I could be wrong, but my perception is that a lot of times those who could possibly support us or in a position to help us move forward, gain the ilm that we need, et cetera, we don't hold value to them in their eyes. We're not people of worth to them, okay? Unfortunately, a lot of our brothers and sisters who have immigrated to this country, not all, but there have been quite a number of them, have a very low opinion of African Americans in general, not just African American Muslims. At some point in time, we've all may have had a conversation. I know I've had a few of them. And whether it's because of other situations, you know, people come out and they say things and you have to, hey, I don't want to hear that, and separate yourself from that because, you know, falling into the riba and the namima and things of that nature there. But in terms of how people interact and how things come out, you hear things. And we know some of the terms that are used about us by certain members of the Muslim community in terms of how they describe us within their own languages. And I've quite often heard it said when individuals are being honest about something, whether they were angry at the next group or something about something that happened between them. But I've often heard them say that most often than not, a lot, I won't say a lot, I say there are some who do not consider us to be real Muslims. And that's just a fact, something that we have to deal with. So being honest, it's going to be difficult to get people who have a image built up in their mind about not offering assistance to African Americans or Muslims in this country in general, if they're not from their group or their masjid. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of difficult to say, because within the context of what we know the deen calls us to, and just good da'wah, is reminding them of the ajr that is attached to supporting people who are not capable of always supporting themselves. The ajr that's attached to facilitating ease and stability for the student of knowledge, for the scholars, for the masjid. You know, we're at a point now where, you know, not talking about the ones who just don't have the money to support like that, but the ones who do, people don't even support the masjid. Like you're talking about, we got masjids around here right now during this period of COVID, you know, and even before, they've had issues going on. You know, you hear them always about, hey, we need the money for the bills this month, things are short. And we know, that particularly within our communities, imams are going out and working jobs and doing things, and they're building up the masjid with their own hands. You know what I'm saying? Things are going on, they need help. They're doing it with their hands because the community is not coming out to support. You know, we come for the khutbah, and then, you know, sometimes, most often than not, we got something to say about the khutbah when it's over with. You know, not talking about the ones who get up there and hijack the minbar of Rasul, but for those who are sincere and they have done and they are working and they're doing and they're transmitting sound knowledge. You know, just because he says something that rubbed you the wrong way, you know what I'm saying? But it was haqq. So, you know, you got all of these different dynamics just within our community. And then you take it outside, and then you have individuals who come in because, again, this is not a point about bringing up conflict between people, because we're not trying to be antagonistic towards anybody. We're trying to find a solution to something. So, but we know the situations, okay? It's the either or situation. Either you have members of the immigrant community or children or families of immigrants who came here previously before second or third generation immigrants to the country. And okay, if they're coming to the masjid and they want to give $5, $10, $20,000 to the masjid for something, it got these restrictions on it. I give you this money if you let me do this. Or if you do this because you need to do this, because when I come from, this is what they do. I want to see you do this, or don't say this no more. You see what I'm saying? Fi sabilillah. You see what I'm saying? Unfortunately, from what I've seen, what I've viewed myself personally, we can't really say that oftentimes what we're doing is fi sabilillah. It's very hard to say that, because when you have that true sense of doing something solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a whole different attitude that comes from that person that gives of their wealth, that gives of their time, that gives of themselves, to assist the Muslims, to assist the masjid, to assist people in general. You see what I'm saying? And for me, that's part of the problem. So that's a question. To answer that question of what you say, what would you say? The response of what you should say is very simple. You do this for Allah and His Rasul, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You do this for the upliftment of Islam and the Muslims and to help push forward this deen. Because at the end of the day, why are we here? Why are we Muslim? We're not Muslim just so we can stay in our house and pray and Eid al-Fitr and, and Ramadan and making these images for other people to look at. We're here, we're Muslim because we're supposed to be here to call people to Allah and His Rasul, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Call people to Islam, period. That's it. That's our job. Honestly, I'm working on it. I do my part within the community. I do a lot of things to help people try to give a good image of Islam to the best of my ability. And honestly, in terms of da'wah, like even with my own family, I don't feel I've been that effective in giving da'wah to my family. I could do better. You see what I'm saying? But again, at the end of the day, that's why we're here. No other reason. To worship Allah, and within the worship of Allah, it constitutes us going out and telling the people about the truth and the reality of Islam and calling them to it. But again, going back to your original question, this can only be accomplished with ikhlas, with sidq, and with a sense of pride and dignity about who we are. You see what I'm saying? So if I look at you and I see something or somebody, well, I should give it that term, I see something that's not really what I honor or give respect to, I'm never going to give you my money. I don't care what you say. You see what I'm saying? So that's why I say the first thing that has to be done, I have to ask you the question, who am I to you? Am I your brother? Or am I just the Muslim? Although they should be synonymous, it's a big difference when you ask that question when we have these things going on inside of our head that keep us from doing what we're supposed to do.
Okay, so I want to end with this. And I truly hope that our audience doesn't mind that we spoke very frankly. We're speaking from experience. We're speaking from private conversations that we've had, or information that we're privy to, whether by books or whether from imams or whether from other scholars. And we're just trying to have an honest conversation to solve a pressing problem. I also believe that the Muslim community that is asking for help or is in need of help, they also have responsibility. They have a responsibility to clearly define their need so that the one who is, giving sadaqah, or the one who is, giving, some type of, resources to help, knows exactly what they're working for or what they're paying for, what they're contributing to. Okay, I believe that. I also believe that, and I also believe that white supremacy is of, fighting against white supremacy is of utmost importance. It's of utmost importance. It is the shaitan of our time. Is a big problem. But we cannot lose fact that we live here in America. We're raising our families here. And we are not going to make it individually. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, over and over again, we're revisiting the same theme. We're revisiting the same question, sometimes in public forums, sometimes in private forums, and now it's in international forum. And I think it's very, very important that, you know, our African American brothers and sisters, they truly, truly make at the top of their agenda, every masjid should have somebody who is specializing in the Islamic sciences. They should have someone who is specializing in the Islamic sciences. You cannot truly, truly guide people or give them access to full Islam, the full Islamic tradition, without the Arabic language, without being able to approach the classical sources, without being able to read, you know, the classical fatawa, understanding usul fiqh, understanding, you know, the issues that are connected to belief. I mean, we have to commit to that. We have to commit to that. And alhamdulillah, me and you, we actually work for an organization that is actively working towards taking one of the most vulnerable, you know, oppressed populations in the land and producing scholars out of them. So I'll let you say the last word, maybe the last comment on that, and don't forget that we only have 9 minutes to answer these questions.
Okay, I want to get to, there are 2 of them. It's pretty much synonymous, similar questions, so I want to answer these right quick. Both of these from the same person, Andrew too. So, Assalamu alaikum, Andrew. Andrew is actually a student of mine from California. I knew him when I stayed out there. He's watching with us. So, Assalamu alaikum, Andrew. How should those who would like to learn go about this, assuming that they're starting from zero? Where do they begin? And how should they be giving back to those they are learning from? And then he asks, how can communities build a desire for knowledge amongst its constituents? All right. Number 1, Andrew, you're doing the right thing, because we do a class on Wednesdays at 9, and he's been joining in on that. So, mashallah. But the thing in terms of just within your community, we know if somebody went off to study and they got proper information. Being fascinated with personalities and names, you understand what I'm saying, has primarily gotten us in the position that we're in right now, honestly. So one thing that we can do is we can consult with people who we know something, and we can ask them, okay, who can I go study with? What would you recommend that I do? How I got in touch with Taba, I wrote a well-known sheikh, and the sheikh, because he was committed to other things at the time, he forwarded my letter to Sheikh Rami them at Taba, and that's how I got connected to Taba when I was inside. Okay, because I wrote the sheikh, I didn't ask him for anything. All I said, give me a list of books in the curriculum that I can study, how to go about studying these books, and what could I do in order to gain knowledge until I'm able to connect with a teacher. Because at the institution I was at, we hadn't had an email come in there for nearly 8 years by the time I wrote this letter and connected with Taba Foundation. And alhamdulillah, that was 2013, and here we are today, mashallah. But that's the main thing. If you want to learn, ask questions. Ask somebody who can point you in the right direction. If you go to somebody and all they can do is give you a book, then you may need to go find somebody else. Because although reading books is good, you're not going to be a person of ilm and understanding of this deen unless you sit down and find yourself a teacher. So identifying teachers, that's the first step. And from that point, following the curriculum that your teacher has and making sure, again, you have to have some understanding about this, that they're teaching from sound sources, well-respected books and texts that go back to the earlier generations and connected to the 4 schools and connected to the books of Aqidah that have been validated by Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, whether it's through the Ash'ariyah or the Maturidiyah. That's the basic. As for the helping and giving back to your teachers, make dua. That's the biggest thing that you can do for us. If we have initiatives and institutions that can be supported, support them in any way that you can. You know, there's nothing wrong with helping other organizations and people that are outside, but if it's something that directly affects your life, then you should be more than happy to put the majority of your money, your zakat and your sadaqah should go into supporting that. If the zakat money can support it, then support it with the zakat. And if it can't, make sure you give as much sadaqah as you can to them first and foremost, because that's where you're benefiting from. That has a direct benefit on your day-to-day life. So that's what you should be supporting. In terms of the communities, that's just a good question, man. I think that's something I'm gonna leave the staff to answer because we haven't figured that out yet. You know, if there's some, like I said, if it's one person that wants to learn, deal with that one person. You know, as you know, Andrew, I've been busy for several months now, and it took me a long time to get back to doing classes again. But I was like, hey, it can wait no more. So I just I'm gonna commit to doing something, and that's what we're doing right now. But facilitate ease for your teachers. If you know they're having difficulty getting things situated, find ways that you can facilitate for them to be able to give to you and to others, and bring others to them so they can learn as well. And Allahu A'lam. Brother Tabari, and your question in terms of, give it to me one more time, please. Just clarify that quickly for me.
How can communities build a desire for knowledge amongst its constituents?
No, your questions.
I'm sorry, I don't remember now.
But overall, bottom line, if we're going to be brothers and sisters, we need to learn how to stand firm upon what Allah and Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam gave to us, and we need to deal with each other like we're actually brothers and sisters, and not these things that we come across and that we have to tolerate because we're Muslim. Big difference. A lot of the situations that we have, and in true honoring of one another, accept the fact that we are different. That doesn't mean that I'm wrong or you're wrong because we're different. We're just different. Yes, my skin is dark, but it doesn't rub off. This is part of the way Allah made me. Okay? This is who I am. I'm not poison to you or your family. My family's not poison. Your family's not poison to me or mine. We can sit down and we eat together. We can build institutions together. We pray together. So we could definitely do these other things together. If we can stand before our Lord and bump shoulders, and although some of us don't want to bump shoulders and stand close in the suhuf nowadays, but you know, that's something else. But it can be done. If we can do that, we can build institutions and we can call people to Allah together, and we can be successful in doing it. There you go, brother.
Alhamdulillah, Brother Andrew, one of the things that I would say, you know, as far as, you know, helping to make, you know, how can communities build a desire for knowledge amongst its constituents? You have to make the knowledge relevant. You have to make the knowledge relevant. I mean, that's one of the things I really, really appreciate about an institution that I, you know, attend and I, you know, actually learn from. Is that they gave me an opportunity to talk to their youth, to teach their youth, and you know, because I have experience, you know, that I have more dunya experience in the dunya, from the effects of the dunya that their kids are falling into. They realized that I could be a good deterrent. And I think that that's what has to happen in every community. You cannot come up with dusty stories from the time of, you know, the great Islamic empires, and it has no relevance to the haram that they are facing on a daily basis. That's not going to work. You have to talk about exactly on the ground, what's happening here on the ground, and then relate it back to those stories. I'll give you an example. One of the biggest problems that we're having right now is that, you know, like people believe in Allah, people believe, you know, in the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they really don't care about what Allah commanded and what Allah prohibited. Okay, there's, like yes, Allah exists, He's the creator of the universe, but I don't really, accept all of those commandments and prohibitions. That's something that has to be addressed. So from that perspective, you have to teach about, consequences. What is Allah has a sunnah, the way He deals with His creation. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of that sunnah, and you got to talk about it in a way, like I said, it's relevant. It's relevant. When you talk about fiqh, right? You don't, Islamic jurisprudence, you have to talk about issues that are relevant, that's actually affecting the people, it's affecting the youth. You know what I mean? So in other words, you don't start talking about well water and things like that before you start talking about recycled water, right? Is recycled water, is it najis? Is it filthy? You talk about things that are relevant. And I think that you will gather their attention. You'll gather their respect. They'll want to listen to you, rather than talking about something that they can't relate to. I think that's very, very important in our times. I mean, we're competing against social media. We're competing against movies. We're competing against music. We're competing. People don't have a lot of patience. So we have to be inventive and to deliver the message in a way that is. It's keeping up with the times. I really believe that that's very important. And I think that we're out of time. Sister Erin said we don't have any questions from Facebook. So Abdul Muhaymin, if you would close us out, I believe that is the end of the show. Am I correct?
Alhamdulillah. Yes, sir.
Erin,
MashaAllah, we thank everybody for joining us this evening. And inshallah, join us next week. We'll be able to explore some more topics. I don't have my paper in front of me right now, so I'm a little tardy with giving you next week's topic. I believe it has something to do with police brutality, inshallah. But we'll have updates for you, and you'll be able to check in with us next week. Please share this with others. We also have a Launch Good campaign that's going right now. It's not a big campaign, but it's necessary nonetheless. So if you go to Launch Good and look for Table Foundation in the most recent campaign that's there, we ask that you support and share that with others as well. And please, please, please make dua for us, that Allah helps us in all of the areas of our lives, and with the work that we're doing here at Table Foundation, and the families and the people that support us, and the people that work here, and our students as well. So, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.